Diego, we are back for another episode of the Somewhere Anywhere podcast.
Happy to be here with you, Rasheed. Hey to every single one of our listeners. And we're starting quite a unique series. I don't think you can get this content anywhere, in English at least. We're going to dive into the different political parties and families of the Spanish democracy. And let's start with the right-wingers, right?
Yeah, so we're going to do a very detailed podcast series. We don't even know how many episodes we're going to get out of this conversation. We're going to cover every political party in Spain of note. I'll probably do a final episode of the ones that aren't that noteworthy.
Even those, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll have fun. Bear with us.
And
There was many of you that stuck with us to the end with a 3-hour episode about Spanish constitution and Spanish rule of law and political system. So this is far more interesting. And that one was fun.
That was fun,
But
yeah.
there was a deep, you call it a deep dive. That was like a dive to the depths of the ocean, right? We're going to have fun, folks. So bear with us. This is going to be interesting and enlightening, I'm
yeah,
sure.
it's going to be great. So we're going to start today with PP, Partido Popular, or the Popular Party. And we're going to really go from the very deep origins of PP. And this is important because, something that we discuss now amongst ourselves and with our foreign friends and colleagues is why does PP seem to be so incoherent, or at least so have desperate views depending on the region, depending on the time of year, all these kind of things. And, I think there's a very clear answer, which is, well, the actual party itself isn't a single homogenous party. And it's in the deep DNA of PP.
Just like Spain is not a completely unified polity, but rather a very plural, very decentralized nation with a lot of different commonalities, sure, but also differences and asymmetries. And you need to factor that in when you understand Spanish politics. Therefore, you also need to understand that when you understand right-wing politics in Spain. And for a foreigner looking at this, or local for that matter of fact, it is true that sometimes you find out, but Madrid is doing so much. I mean, some of the best free market policies in the West are taking place in Madrid. Madrid is the place to be for many libertarians these days, right? So it's Argentina under Milei, sure, but how come that same party, PP, Popular Party, which is a large political family, the largest in Europe, the European Commission president, it's Ursula von der Leyen, it belongs to this party. The current Chancellor of Germany is Chancellor Merz. He's linked to this party. The CDU is the Popular Party, European Popular Party member of Germany. So why then is it that the national PP does not have the same pro-free market, open society, cosmopolitan, libertarian mentality that you see in the Madrid PP? Well, we're about to tell you why, and this is a complex discussion. And by the way, if there was such thing as podcasts back in the 80s, we would have recorded about how the right wing was trying to unify itself. However, in the 90s and in the 20s, and for the first half of the 2010s, the right wing was unified. So saying right wing in Spain and PP was synonym.
That's a good point, yeah.
And in the last 10 years, the right wing split in three. So PP was only one of three parties with relevance in the right wing scene, and still today split in two. There is another sort of alt-right party, Vox, which is a spin-off of PP. So this is why getting context and understanding the background is going to be useful for anyone following our episode, or Spanish politics for that matter.
So, like most conversations in modern Spanish politics, we have to start at the transition. And of course, for listeners, we do have an episode on the transition, a very early episode. We're probably going to do another one at some point very soon. But essentially, this is when Franco, the dictator Franco, died in 1975. That kick-started a new period of Spanish history where the politicians and the king at the time wanted to reform the Spanish state into something new. And the thing that they reformed it into, and the process to get to that point, was called the transition. And that is where modern Spain comes from. The current constitution is from 1978, from this period post-Franco. And this is where the history of PP properly starts. And to get into that, PP is not the original identity of the thing that we now call PP. You can probably put the correct origin to AP, Alianza Popular.
Mm-hmm. So AP, Alianza Popular, the Popular Alliance, which it's a very similar name, was one of the different parties that sprang out once Franco has passed. The monarch, Juan Carlos, King Juan Carlos, sort of channels and pilots a transition towards democracy that brings in all political families and sensibilities, which is a reason why, although there's aspects of the transition that many people may discuss or criticize, overall on the net it's seen as a big success. So long dictatorship ended. Prior to that, there had been a very violent Second Republic, which in principle it was a democratic regime. In practice, it was definitely not one, and a very illiberal regime, full of turbulence. And then, of course, 40 years under General Franco. So suddenly, here is democracy. And so civil society is trying to organize. And there's literally dozens of parties, dozens. Of political. But there's only 4 that make it. And in a way, today, there's 4 main political parties in the Spanish political scene, which is something that is interesting. Like almost half a century has gone by. And you could argue that back in the day, we had a center-right party and a right-wing party, a center-left party, and a far-left party. And today, one could argue we have 2 far-left parties, a standard conservative party, and an alt-right party. And PP was one of the elements that was present in that early split. So therefore, it was one of the 4 main parties that was involved in the constitution. But although today it is seen as the moderate force of the Spanish center-right, back in the 1970s, it was seen to be on the right of the center-right spectrum. So that is why, although Spain did have a center-right president from almost when Franco dies all the way up to 1982, so there's like 7 years of leadership under the UCD party, PP was seen as the more right-wing party, more conservative, less appealing for the masses. So that is the origins of PP, a group, a political group that comes up once Franco has died, and that is originally the 4th largest party in the country.
But let's even give some more details on that, because I found that particular period quite interesting. So yes, when Franco died, I'm thinking all of the details of this conversation. So when Franco died, the powers of...
Can we pause there for a second? Franco died, which means that his regime ends with his physical end.
Yeah, yes.
That is something that, I mean, of course, it comes as obvious, but this is not the case in other regimes that have been either overthrown or have withdrawn power somehow. When he dies, when he physically dies, that's when the transition starts. So, which is
what, 83, 85?
He dies in 75. He dies in 1975. He was 80.
I think 83.
Yeah, 83, 4 years old. He had been sick for a few months, and that's when the king decides to, pivot towards a democratic system.
So it's on that point. So the king, why the king? Well, Franco made the king. I am still unclear why this specific thing happened. But before Franco died, years before Franco died, Franco made the king his official successor to all the power. This is kind of crazy to me, to be clear. But Franco, the dictator, brought back the monarchy under Juan Carlos, who was, I think, not supposed to be the actual monarch succession. It was his brother or father. But Franco chose Juan Carlos.
They skipped the father because he did not get along with Franco.
Okay.
So they went straight to the son. But since the elder son had actually died, in a hunting accident with King Juan Carlos himself, a shotgun was fired. And so the second son of the heir was the one that eventually became king.
Juan Carlos.
Who is Juan Carlos, yes.
So Franco chose Juan Carlos, again, long before he died, to become his successor when he does die. And that's what happened. So when Franco died, there was no power struggle. The law, the courts, everything continued. And Juan Carlos became the head of the Spanish
state. Yeah, the head of the state.
At that time.
Yeah.
And it was Juan Carlos, as head of state, that essentially decided, no, we're going to transition to democracy, which to me is a remarkable thing to say.
Yeah.
Truly.
When I speak to some of the Chicago boys that were involved in the reform process in Chile under Pinochet, you could clearly see how both in the Spanish and Chilean example, the first instinct of the military leaders was to just, hold power and control in a country that was descending into chaos, right? Peter Thiel was recently visiting Chile and learning firsthand from José Piñera, who is, I consider, a friend and who was responsible for the capitalization system that has resulted in the savings accounts for all workers and so on. But when Piñera explains this, he clearly identifies two parts of this regime. And the second one being one where the civilians take power, start to put together the sort of reforms that lead to democracy, and eventually there is a democracy. And in that case, Pinochet does establish a vote where he's voted out and he leaves power and leaves it in the hands of a new political system that came after him. In a way, this is a similar process because Franco's first reaction was, economically speaking, was very interventionist until the late 50s. Politically speaking, of course, it was an authoritarian regime that was mostly concerned with keeping law and order after so much chaos under the Second Republic and the Civil War. But then, obviously, started to open up, more freedom, economically speaking, or also for civic society. Granted, still a dictatorship, but becoming way more open in many aspects. And so this facilitates the fact that when the king calls for a move towards democracy, it doesn't really come as a shock because Spain was clearly moving in that direction. And that was probably the plan from the get-go. But Franco understood that he could not present himself to be a democratic leader after 40 years of autocratic rule, but he did understand that the times were changing and that after him, something different needed to come. But they were concerned with order, so everything was done very orderly. So the banned political parties were legalized. Mm-hmm. There was no violence, not a single drop of blood was shed. So it was a peaceful transition to democracy, something of which Spaniards are naturally proud of, regardless of the fact that, of course, some things could have been done better.
Yeah, there were some issues, of course, but it was primarily quite good and quite salient and quite peaceful. So after Franco died, Juan Carlos, the king at the time, also importantly, the head of state in complete control, all powers, all legal authority is him.
And to be precise, he's the head of state at this point, and he may be referred to as king because of nobility.
Right.
But Spain is not a monarchy, technically speaking, at this point. There is a vote to create a democratic Congress 1 year after Franco dies. Then this Congress drafts a constitution, which is then voted, and then Spain is proclaimed to be, formally and officially, a democratic monarchy.
Right, so after the official constitution.
So technically, between 1975 and 1978, the 3 years that go by between Franco's death and the constitution is proclaimed and voted for by around 90% of Spaniards, Spain becomes a monarchy, a democratic monarchy. And in the meantime, we do have a monarch, but that the title there is for nobility reasons. Sure. He's only legally constituted as...
It would be more accurate to call him the dictator at the time.
Yes, you could. Sure. Probably from 75 to 76, he's doing the harakiri, like the Japanese would say. So he's surrendering absolute power, but he did have absolute power because he inherited from Franco. So if he wanted to, he could have stayed forever, right? Unless someone threw him out, of course. But he did have absolute power, and they pivot into democracy. So that was
this pivot is the important part. So when Juan Carlos, as head of state, he chose his former tutor, Torquato Miranda Fernandez, to lead the Council of State. And then as the leader of the Council of State, he had to give a list to the head of state, Juan Carlos, to select a new prime minister. And he maneuvered his way internally to get Adolfo Suarez to be on the list. And then Juan Carlos chose Suarez to be the prime minister. This is an important fact because another important figure here, Manuel Fraga.
Yes.
So Manuel Fraga was a minister. Well, he was an official in the Franco regime. During the transition period, he was a minister and someone who was an ambassador. But he thought that he should have chosen as the prime minister by Juan Carlos, but he was not. Suarez was chosen as the prime minister. And that started this tension now between Suarez and Fraga that we're going to get to at some point.
Exactly.
Short.
So long story short, many parties come up. Of course, everyone there was like competition to actually, legitimize the movements that wanted to have a future in the new...
Yeah, it was Suarez that legalized the Communist Party, for example.
Yes,
He did it
yes.
on Holy Sunday of all times to do it.
Yes.
And that was, again, 75, 76. And then it had the first democratic election in Spain since 1936 was in June 1977.
Yes.
And that is when the current landscape started to get filtered.
Don't want to get in a rabbit hole here, but there's many things we could say about that 1936 election, by the way.
That's the thing.
Okay? But let's not go that rabbit
Yeah.
hole at this point. Okay?
So-
But since the 30s, Spain had not had a
Exactly,
free
called the
election.
Franco
Yeah.
regime.
Yeah.
So in 77 election, there were four major parties that came from that. It
But let's forget about the left for today's episode.
Yeah, but I'll just make
Yes.
the point. We're not going to get into details, but to make the point is UDC, that's the Suarez party, that got 34% of the vote. PSOE, the left party, got 29%.
Currently in government.
Current government. PSE, the communists, they got 9%. And then AP, the Manuel Fraga's party, the origin of PP, only got 8% in the first ever election.
So the idea of having Suarez become the favorite of the elites to be the new democratic face of Spain is a top-down move, 100%. And it essentially he was the head of the state broadcaster. He was the head of our
propagandist.
BBC, yeah. So he was obviously someone that journalists knew, politicians knew. He was fairly young. And if you want to narrow down his ideas, his readings, his influx, I really respect his work as someone that tried to bring people together. So don't take this as a negative read on him. I do have criticism. Mostly economic policy was horrendous, to be honest, in the first years of the transition. By just trying to compromise with the unions and with the socialists all the time, he actually got nothing done from the center-right platform that in principle he represented. But that's a different conversation. But Suarez really had a very bland ideology. He just knew that it was time to modernize Spain. So he just knew that the institutions needed to be homogeneous to these European democracies that we wanted to look like and sort of emulate. So he was mostly concerned with piloting that institutional reform. But he was that darling that the elites chose to be the sort of the face of the new democratic system. And that explains why he was the winner of almost every election that was held until 1982. So his party, UCD, was a coalition of many parties. But again, it really doesn't matter because they did not have that much of a real social base. It was more of like the king and the people around him sort of signaling that, hey, this is our guy. Like he was a reformist under the Franco regime because he was definitely not a nostalgic guy that didn't want democracy, but rather someone who believed in it. And he can represent peaceful change. Now, Fraga, which you just mentioned, is a different story. Because Fraga had been a minister for Franco. So everyone knew Fraga. Every civilian knew Fraga. Now, it's true that he was a very reformist minister. So, for example, the censorship was essentially lifted off under Fraga. Foreign investment and foreign tourism were essentially allowed and developed with Fraga's reforms. And Fraga himself believed in that democracy needed to be the new paradigm for Spain. So definitely not a nostalgic. Plus, Fraga read, a couple of books every day, was very heavily inspired by the British political system and really wanted to have a democracy that could be compared to the UK one. So a larger-than-life figure. Just Google him. He looks the part. He's quite a towering figure for the center-right. But Manuel Fraga was someone that, although he had surely the credentials to be a head of government in terms of having done very significant reforms, Fraga was a man of the past. And that is, I guess, the original sin that Alianza Popular was always going to deal with as long as he was in power. And that is why he only got 8% of the vote.
8% of the vote. Again, so he didn't agree with Suarez, so he had essentially a vendetta, a jealousy, and he decided to not join UCD, the Unión de Centro Democrático, Center Democratic Union. and he formed AP with some other hardline Francoist people. So there are not that many of them.
To be clear, all of these people that had been on the Franco regime did believe in democracy, all of them were reformist ministers under Franco. So I'm just saying this because it's easy to then just pinpoint PP's origins back to the Franco regime. Well, these people fought for a freer Spain, serving under Franco, and then once they had the choice, they clearly stood with democracy. Fraga is one of the men who drafted the Spanish Constitution.
Well, okay, about that. Let me, devil's advocate here in some ways. So when the election happened in 1977, then they started the process of doing the actual constitutional draft, the new constitution. So from the Congress, there was a drafting committee chosen. And a drafting committee consisted of 3 deputies from UCD, 1 from PSOE, 1 from AP, 1 from the Communists, and 1 from the Catalan minority. So Fraga was the person from AP chosen to essentially draft. So he literally drafted the constitution that eventually went for a vote.
Yeah, he's a founding father of the Spanish Constitution and democracy. So that is why, the idea of trying to present Fraga negatively because he had been a minister of Franco is this sort of read on history that fails to understand context.
But to me, here's the complication, though, Diego, is when they did the vote in Congress for the new constitution, AP didn't vote completely in favor of it. So 5 people from AP voted for approving the new constitution. 3, I believe, voted against, and then 1 had abstained or something like that. So it wasn't even the case that all of AP voted for the transitional regime that most people in the consensus wanted.
But it's true that when you're going through a constitutional convention, not everyone may agree with what is being presented or what is going to be submitted to referendum. And if you trace the reasons for the hesitation within the group, many of them are still valid in today's right-wing circles, like people in liberal, conservative, libertarian, moderate, Christian democratic, even moderate social democrats. They do believe that the Constitution gave a lot of leeway for separatism to grow, for example, or that some other elements of the way in which decentralization was conceived were not proper. So these needs to be taken into account. Those concerns will still hold if you talk to a regular random right-wing or center-right person that you walk through in the street. To be clear, although that position was held in Congress, AP did campaign in favor of the Constitution. By the way, all 4 parties campaigned in favor of the Constitution. So when it really came down to telling people what to vote for, there was no split. Not internally, but rather within all parties. The Communists and the party that was seen as being the more hardline right, which was AP, and later to become Popular Party, they all campaigned for the Constitution, which was approved by more than 80% of the vote.
Yeah, it was like almost 70% of the population voted in the referendum, and then over 85% voted to approve the new constitution of Spain in 78. Okay, but then to the origins point. But we mentioned AP. But AP is, again, I mentioned they only got 8% of the vote in 77. What is a minor party by any metric. But then something started happening. In the 80s, the UDC began to collapse. And as you mentioned, this is a federation of parties. It's not itself a singular party. There are many different small little groups involved there. And they started to break off. And the actual UDC kind of really pushed forward and they were breaking up after Suarez had lost confidence and all these kind of things. So therefore, you had new parties pop up. You had Partido Liberal, you had the Partido Democrático Centro, you had many, many small parties also pop up. This is the early 80s now.
Yes. So UCD was probably just a vehicle for the transition. It was just the right face for the transition. The one reformist who could get the communists and the conservatives and the Franco reformists and the moderate socialists and the centrists and just everyone to rally together around the idea of beyond party politics, let's first set up a democracy. So Suarez will always get the utmost respect from me and from so many Spanish to be honest, because he was able to channel that transition. Now, having said that, the man was not fit for actual dealing with the challenges of the time, because he was not a man of ideas. He was just a man of, a very apt politician in terms of reaching deals, agreements, in order to press forward with this transition to democracy. But then economic policy, like I said, was not very good. Ideas-wise, UCD was a centrist party, but what do centrist parties stand for? One could argue, moderation. One could argue nothing, right? Sometimes trying to be like pleasing the left and the right at the same time, and you end up pleasing no one. So when UCD starts facing the fact that it was a useful vehicle for transition, but not a useful vehicle for government, that's when AP suddenly has a chance. Because when Suarez's leadership collapses in the early 80s, and it becomes apparent that eventually a socialist party with a young leader like Felipe González, who had some, by the way, pro-free market people around on his circle at first. Hard to believe that is the same party that is now running Spain, but that was certainly the case in the 80s. That's the perfect opportunity for AP. So that's when AP decided to create this to just go for this hostile takeover and just essentially take the reins of, and all of that vote from the disappearance of UCD almost translates immediately to AP in the 1982 election, in which Fraga will see a significant jump, and it will clearly become the leader of the opposition, and UCD will essentially stop existing at this point. Suarez wasn't even president. In that last year, he actually left power to Calvo Sotelo.
It was
Leopoldo
Calvo Sotelo became the head of the UDC in the 82 election.
Yes. And by the way, they went from government to having 3 seats. So UCD just disappears.
Collapse.
And Popular Alliance, the predecessor of the Popular Party, just becomes the main party of the center-right, but of course now in opposition.
So now in opposition. At the same time, there are these other parties. So, for example, I guess perhaps we can say maybe our favorite party, Unión Liberal.
Yes, but that was... Yes, but...
That was in 83. That started in 83.
Exactly. As much as we would like to think that there was a liberal movement that popped up and was eventually relevant, or as much as the moderates and the center would also like to think so, this was all a operation led by Fraga. So essentially Fraga realizes, okay, now UCD doesn't exist. Now I'm not the guy because I'm not president, but I can broaden my base if I present my party from now on as a coalition of those parties, of other parties that, touch upon those areas of the political spectrum where I just can't seem to convince people. So from AP, there was a conscious decision to sort of, on the one way, just finance, because there was a financial support for it, but on the other way, just to assimilate and bring them forward and create coalition and bring them into their list of candidates of small political groups that they wanted to inflate and prop up.
This was Coalición Popular.
Exactly.
Popular Coalition.
So now they become the Popular Coalition. Now it's no longer the Popular Alliance. But it's artificial, to be honest. Like Pedro Schwartz, former president of the Montpellier Society, one of the most relevant classical liberal thinkers
of
the
our
last
episode guests.
Exactly. A friend of Popper, of Hayek, of Mises, of Friedman for sure. No, sorry, he did not meet with Mrs. like that. Mrs. was a bit older than him. But a friend of Popper, Hayek, Friedman for sure, president of the Montpellier Society. Do check that Pedro Schwartz episode if you have not. It's an amazing conversation we had with him. We even played Karl Popper's piano once we were done taping because it's actually sitting in his house.
Yeah.
But Schwartz was, a member of a liberal elite which existed. Esperanza Aguirre, who was the main architect of the free market system in Madrid that now survives under the leadership of Governor Ayuso, she was part of that group. But that was it wasn't a big political party. If they had to finance a campaign and stand for election, they wouldn't got nowhere. But AP decided, okay, let's prop up these little groups. One was PDP, which was former members of UCD, centrist elites, prestigious lawyers and people that were known in political circles.
Partido Democrática
Popular, yeah? So PDP. And then let's also prop up the liberals, right? So that there is a libertarian or classical liberal party. And then let's present ourselves as a coalition. And you would see some advertisement would be Libertarians for Fraga, or like moderates for Fraga, as in trying to present this to the electorate as, okay, we keep on broadening our base and we represent not just the right, but also the center-right.
So one of the other parties you mentioned implicitly, but to make it explicit, was Partido Liberal, which was a separate party from, well, again, separate institutionally from Unión Liberal with Pedro Suárez. So in 83, Partido Liberal was kind of refounded by Enrique Larroque. I can't do double R. Larroque.
Yeah. But again, like, this was all a managed transition. Pedro Suárez explained to us in our episode how he voted for NATO accession at a point when Fraga made the horrible call, for which he was berated for by Margaret Thatcher herself, who called him into his office to just learn why the hell Spanish conservatives were voting against NATO accession. Fraga was only doing this because the socialist government had campaigned against NATO accession. So then he thought, okay, the government's own base has voted for a government that said no to NATO. So now if the government is saying yes to NATO, his own voters won't go for it. So let's just ask our voters to abstain, and that will be a big defeat for the socialist government, which will elevate myself. Totally stupid idea, but that was the calculus, right? So Pedro Suárez, and the Unión Liberal Party, they believed in NATO accession. They believed in the Reagan and Thatcher approach that the Western democracies had to be united against the communist threat, and they believed in common joint security forces and strategies. So when Unión Liberal split from that coalition and supported NATO accession, and when Pedro Suárez was seen voting when Fraga had asked them to abstain, and certainly Pedro did not hide from anyone in doing this, then they decided to feed the other Partido and to then eventually combine them together. But this time it was essentially they were just replacing Pedro with someone they could control more. But there was never such thing as of an organic libertarian movement. You know, it was always PP trying to prop up a liberal party that they could. Yeah, AP, yeah, trying to prop up this idea of a coalition that would result. And to be honest, the 1986 result was the same as the 1982 result.
Right.
And that's when people realize, well, it's not a matter of a coalition, it's a matter of you, Frag. You've reached your ceiling. So he was able to create a political movement for the center-right. He was able to unite different sensibilities that have become relevant because today there is a big libertarian scene in Spain and a centrist scene. So he clearly understood how all of that had to fit under the same umbrella if they wanted electoral success. But his leadership had a ceiling. So that was called El Techo de Fraga, which literally translates as Fraga's ceiling. And by the way, that is why Felipe González, the socialist prime minister, was very happy to always give Fraga a very institutional role as the opposition leader, because he knew that Fraga would never be as popular as him. He was still seen as a man of the past who was trying his best to reform the right wing, and everyone thought Fraga was very intelligent and a very smart guy. Like, the left really respected him. Like, today's socialists will say, like, yeah, Fraga was a Franco minister. Back in the day, they respected the hell out of him because he was a cultured man, a man of state. But González knew he had a ceiling. That's why he favored having him as his opposition leader. That is like if you can have Kamala run as the Democratic Party candidate forever, like, you would do that because she was just so bad, right? So this was a similar example.
So Fraga, again, this is to me surprising because Fraga himself decided something has to give, and that actually means me. I have to give. And he decided in 1989 to call for what we call, I guess we call the refounding of the party to something new. So in 89, Fraga called this massive congress, as in the internal party members, to come to Sevilla to have a session and to vote on some new changes to the structure of the party. And during that time, of course, some things happened. One, Partido Liberal dissolved and joined the new PP.
Party, yeah.
So at this time in 89, it's when the name changed to Partido Popular, Popular Party. So the Partido Liberal dissolved, officially joined PP, no more coalition. There are some other parties like the Partido Democrático.
The moderates.
They joined, they dissolved and also joined PP as well. So a curious point, from that party, the PDP, there were some major figures from that party that actually became major figures in PP,
Yes.
like Jaime Mayor Oreja,
Yes.
who was eventually a minister under Aznar, so we'll get to. But these are different institutions. Yes, they had links and coalitions and some funding, but they had different internal logics, different internal players, different internal ideas and plans, and they kind of all dissolved and formed into this new thing we call PP at the 1989 conference.
There are some things that need to be taken into account here, which is some of the secrets of the 1986 to 1989 period, right? And there are some writings about this, but many Spaniards don't even know about what I'm about to share, right? So the first thing is that Fraga was horrible at managing the finances of the party. The party was terribly indebted. And so after the 1986 election, that became apparent. And, the big donors and the banks and the large companies that wanted a strong and successful center-right party started to actually apply some pressure. They were saying, okay, so economic elites, we've supported you, Fraga, to become, the leader. Clearly succeeded at creating a movement, a political platform, but you will not be elected president. We're sorry, but that's sort of become apparent now. So Fraga realized that. Then internally, within the party, there was a push for a different leadership, which eventually happens. There is a different leader that is called up. He's Andalusian. He's called Hernández Mancha. He's still around these days. He published a memoir. If he speaks English, I'm unsure of that. It'd be awesome to have him on the podcast, but he's a very unknown figure, to be honest, because he was it was a very short-lived leadership, but he was the face of PP for a while. But still, things were not fully working. Mm-hmm. And the economic elites tried to push especially from Catalonia, they tried to create a different party. So there was a competing, well-funded attempt, mostly from the Catalonian economic elites, to create a new center-right platform. So, okay, Fraga has a ceiling, let's create a different party. That push existed. It was known as the Roca Operation because the leader of this was a man called Miquel Roca, who was, by the way, had been involved in the transition, very successful lawyer, and there was some very smart people involved in that. The current president of Real Madrid, Florentino Perez, who is a very successful businessman, a billionaire, he was involved in that. And this was a very well-kept secret of the, what happened in between, just in the shadows of the center-right. The Employers Federation was heavily involved with, separating a bit from Fraga and trying to see if this operation would succeed. It was a total disaster. I think they won one seat.
They won 0 seats.
0 seats. It was nothing, right?
And won nothing.
Nothing. So because the Roca Operation failed, that was a dawning moment for everyone. So economic elites realized, okay, so PP is our only bet. So if we want to finance a party and not just have the socialists in power forever, which, by the way, they were in power for 14 years, 82 to 96, so it was obvious that they had to find an alternative. PP is going to be it. It's not going. There's no way around PP. Fraga has succeeded in uniting the Spanish center-right. We've wasted our money in this separate attempt of launching a different movement. The other alternative, Hernández Mancha, was short-lived, so Fraga, it wasn't the solution, but just putting someone else isn't the solution either. And so we find ourselves at this crossroads. And even worse for the economic elites, the free market reforms of the first period under Felipe González really alienated the left-wing base of the Socialist Party that was surely not expecting that to be their policy. So moving there from 88, 89 forward, it becomes a socialist party, a proper socialist party, which is not good news for the employers, for the economic freedom. So everyone becomes really concerned, but something has to give, and things needed to change, and that's when 1989 happens, and that is the year in which the Berlin Wall falls, and also the Fraga Wall falls, I guess, here, and a new movement needs to be created out of the ashes of what Fraga had built, which, to be honest, was a lot, but he hit his ceiling.
You mentioned Mancha. So Mancha also resigned. So he resigned as the head of the party, and then Fraga came back as the interim president until they chose a new person. But though they have to find a new person.
And there was this woman who was eventually the Minister
Tocino.
of Agriculture, exactly, Isabel Tocino, who was seen as the most well-dressed, the most beautiful politician of the era by the press. So she was a glamorous woman, and she was seen as a very apt politician as well, a very well-prepared face, and she was seen as everything Fraga could not be. She was someone that could spark interest and seem new. So that's what Fraga wanted to go for. So Fraga's instincts were there. Let's go for Isabel Tocino. Let's make her the face of the party. But that wasn't the final decision.
That's not what happened, no. So just give us some landmarks here. So again, we are coming now.
Tocino, by the way, means bacon.
Yes.
So she didn't have the most glamorous surname, but she was a glamorous. And by the way, that's beyond style and looks. She was a very apt woman.
So we have a situation here where there is this ceiling for AP, a ceiling for Fraga. They can't seem to dethrone the socialists in any material way, any real way, in any part of Spain, until 87, where there was a young guy in Castilla y León that somehow managed to defeat the socialists in a regional presidential election, and that was José María Aznar.
Of course. So he would eventually become the prime minister between 96 and 2004. He would therefore be the first head of government from PP. But like you said, he was a regional leader. So if you just take that at face value, you would think like these are local politics of sorts. Yeah. But not so much in his case. He was convinced that there was such thing as a path forward for the Spanish center-right. So he always positioned himself very carefully in trying to not just be a regional president, but also thinking of the big issues of the time, fighting the national government when necessary from the regional level. And granted, we've said this many times before, Spain is de facto federal, right? So this is akin to having a state governor in the U.S., fight back. So think Gavin Newman in California or Ron DeSantis against Biden in back in the day. So or of course, Ayuso these days against Sanchez here locally. So his profile began to grow. And people internally in the party started to realize, okay, you seem to be mesmerized by Isabel Tocino. She, of course, seems to fit the, what if you sketch what the ideal candidate looks like, it would be someone with her credentials.
The charisma, the attraction,
yes.
That kind of thing.
And Fraga was seen as, non-charismatic, guy with a mustache. Like the mustache was always brought up as something very serious, not with a lot of humor. You
mean Fraga or Aznar?
Aznar. Well, yeah. Surely Fraga had no sense of humor whatsoever. He's just an angry old guy, right? But Aznar was seen as like not in principle a appealing candidate.
Whereas he was notoriously dull. Dull. I mean, even now you hear him speaking in a podcast, and it's like extremely dull.
Yes, like I would of course disagree that he's dull if you pay attention to what he says.
I mean, dull in terms of personality.
Yes.
In the charisma.
Introspect type of speaking.
Correct. That's what I mean. And I mean I don't mean dull like literally dull.
Yeah. But he mumbles like this.
Is that how he talks?
Yeah.
And he also has like the career background of a cartoonish dull person who's a tax inspector.
Yeah.
Right? Like all of these things together, you would not think this is the guy that transforms or would transform Spain.
And I think, in all honesty, you take out Reagan and Thatcher out of the equation. And from the 80s to the mid-2000s, I think he was probably the most successful, relevant, pro-liberty leader in any OECD country.
Well, he certainly was.
And we can say many reasons why, and we can do...
We'll do an episode about him.
We'll do episodes about him, yeah, sure. But by the way, we're writing a book about his reforms. We've revealed this before on the Esperanza Aguirre podcast, so you will be able to read, not just listen to these stories at some point. But yeah, on paper, you've got this stunning lady who's got this law background, and she seems to fit into what the ideal candidate would look, sound like, think like. And then you have the tax inspector who became a regional...
from a rural party.
And yes, also, to be honest, it's true that his grandfather had been a relevant man in the newspaper industry. He had been involved in the Second Republic. He was a very open-minded reformist leader, and the people he was surrounded with were brilliant. Mm-hmm. He had a brilliant number of advisors around him. We recently had a private interview with one of them. We are hoping to bring him on the podcast, so I will not name him for now, just for privacy reasons, but if he's willing to go on the record, that will be a delight.
And this is what we call in Spain the Clan de Valladolid.
Yes,
Yeah.
the Valladolid bunch, right?
Yeah.
Valladolid is a city, like it's a 1 hour train ride or a 2 hour car ride away from Madrid. That's where the administrative capital of Castilla and Leon is, and that's where Aznar was operating from. And so, in principle, a regional leader doesn't have to become a thing nationally, but he became so well seen internally that at some point everyone flew to Galicia, where Fraga was, or is originally from Galicia. I am as well. By the way, Fraga, once he leaves the national stage, he becomes the president of Galicia for like 15 years.
We'll get there.
We'll get there, you know? But while he's there on his summer house, so convinced in Perves, where he would go fishing in the morning and then read a bunch of books and write, and he would work all day long. This guy never had a day off in his life. Remarkable character, really. And he's there, he's fully convinced that it's Isabel Tocino, and there's 4 guys that essentially get in a plane and then get in a car and just drive there to just essentially, he thinks he's just ready to have all of these 4 guys that work for him, the 4 top guys in the party, ready to just sign off on the Tocino selection. And they just tell him, no, it's not her, it's him, it's Aznar. So he doesn't understand, he's caught off guard. They take a few days, they take the weekend off to think about it and to talk this through. And when the weekend is over, the decision is made, yes, it's him. So Fraga surrenders power. Then he will do this publicly, but privately, this really happens in the Galicia weekend, in which this guy was ready to just essentially knight his successor as you know, but it wasn't her, it was him.
He outmaneuvered by his party members. I say outmaneuvered, but he was convinced by the people who he trusted in the party that no, the Tocino choice was wrong and you should go with Aznar, even though on the surface it seems crazy to do this thing. Non-charisma tax inspector. But clearly the people around Aznar saw something that was clearly true that wasn't apparent at the time.
And I think that it was probably for the better, because Aznar then proved a very apt leader. And in every single election after Aznar was chosen, UP's share of the vote grew. So he ran a first election. We will speak about all of this with more detail. But he first stands in 89 and gets a very good result compared to where the polls were. Because at this time, Fraga has left, Hernández Mancha comes in. It's a disaster in the European election, so he's run out. Fraga is back, but it's just an interim candidate. And then Aznar is thrown into an election almost with no time to prepare.
But also because the in the 89 party, socialists saw that Pepe is reorganizing.
So let's call for an early election. Yeah,
exactly.
So Aznar has no time to prepare, but just runs for the election, does well. Then in 93, he does very well. And then in 96, he wins. Yeah. And then in 2000, he wins by an absolute majority. So 4 elections, all of them remarkable growth. So he broke the ceiling. So it was the right call to make. But it's funny. Like the 4 main guys of the party go and met the godfather of the Spanish right to convince him that, you think it's her, but no, it's not her, it's him.
It's him, yeah. So in the 89 conference, we mentioned a Sevilla event where Pepe properly really started at the reorganization. So that happened in 89. And that's when things really start to change. Context again. AP existed. These other parties that AP kind of spurred and seeded. But again, with different institutional logics, they dissolved and they joined AP and created PP. And then in the 89 conference, again, the new party elected Aznar as the chosen successor of Fraga officially. There's a very interesting thing that happened also at that conference with Aznar and Fraga.
Yes, because Aznar signed a resignation letter that he publicly wanted to hand in to Fraga so as to signal, okay, I stepped in. This
undated one.
Yes. And then just keep this, because Fraga was going to remain president of the political organization. So he wanted to give him this signed resignation letter that he could use at any time. And he just wanted to sort of signal that, okay, I was called to stand in for this election. I did the best I could. We had a good result. But this is not necessarily my ship to run. So here is my resignation letter. I want this organization and all of the country to know.
After subservience to
I'm
Fraga.
serving my party.
Yeah.
So if I was asked to be a candidate, I ran for it. I did my best. We did a good result, but we lost. So here's my resignation letter. Please execute it whenever you want. I don't need to be here if you don't want me to be here. So Fraga gets on stage
And to be clear, this was in private, it was a personal conversation
Yes.
between him and Fraga.
So Fraga gets on stage, tells the anecdote for the world to know, brings up the signed letter, and rips it up in front of everyone.
All the cameras, everything.
For everyone to tape it, and he says, "You are not being managed. You will not be bossed by anyone. You're the boss."
Yeah, that was a pivotal moment in history of Spanish politics. So one thing before we leave the Sevilla conference that I thought was particularly interesting, the slogan of the refounding of AP into PP was avanzar en libertad, to advance in liberty, which is almost the same thing of Milei's party now in Argentina, La Libertad Avanza.
Yeah.
It's like very curious parallel between these two organizations.
Something's been lost there for many. Those of us who believe in freedom have been inspired through the years by the writings of so many authors or the acts of relevant leaders and intellectuals and surely economists that are more linked to the Anglosphere, right? But with this podcast, we try to bridge this gap between the Hispanic world and the Anglo world. And I certainly believe that one of the unsung heroes of the last 40 years or so is Aznar. And when you start looking at the legacy that he left behind, the consequences of having one of the largest economies in Europe commit to these ideas of an open society and a free economy, commit to it so openly, and then actually developing and executing a program that was fully coherent with properly done econ policy, open society. Migration, we're very pro-migration here in an orderly manner, of course, and in a smart way. Surely not the way Sanchez government is doing it. Aznar is like, during his years, that's when people literally started migrating to Spain. There was no migration to Spain whatsoever. Like around 1% of the population was of foreign origin only when he came over. And so millions of people were living in Spain that had flocked to our country following his 8 years in office. And that's the result of these ideas that were like so refreshing for a party that had been struggling to find a discourse, trying to find its place in civil society. And that conference, that speech in Sevilla, it's remarkable. And through the years, he cultivated this narrative, and just this has really stood the test of time. I'm pulling up some of the things he said back then, so if I can just quote and translate on the fly. He was saying, socialist projects have nothing left to offer. That's become apparent here, just like in Eastern Europe, in any country. Anywhere socialism has been applied, societies have found that they ultimately end up in disaster. But that also calls for new and good and positive alternatives. Now, we are not looking for an hegemony of ideas. We are not looking to just apply power on everything that doesn't think like us. We're looking to develop a proposal for an open society. We want to dialogue, not to have citizens dissolve into submission to the state. We are looking for a new system of political relationships. In that strategy, we want to press forward with freedom. Not only will a new government be good for our democracy, because it will mean that there is different parties being able to come to power and not just the same old, but also many principles that come out of this. We want to have Spaniards become happy and confident in their country. Again, we are not mistrustful of individuals. We actually believe in them, and we think that they don't want more state intervention, censorship, threats from power, and a continued intent on control. We believe in the ability of society to organize for themselves, to pursue free initiative and just personal freedom. And we think that this is not just as fair, but also free and therefore more valid than any government-run initiative. And we do not just believe we should just accept that this alternative cannot be built. We want to give the main character of this film needs to be the citizen. More rough translation here and very much on the fly. But that's what he was saying.
Yeah. So now you have this transition to the new founding of PP under Aznar. And this is where you have to, again, take a pause and recap where we came from. You have essentially now the three strands of PP. You have the liberal strand. Again, we discussed the different party, different institutions that came in. Obviously, Aznar is from that liberal strand that points towards markets, entrepreneurship, merit, and the individual factor at the center of politics. And then you have the Christian Democrats that also came in to AP as well from the different smaller parties that come into AP in 89 that stand for more dignity, social balance, family, language, politics, and the idea that freedom should be embedded into all the legal architecture. So much more institutionalist European center-right movement. But then you still have the conservative strand that the Fraga wing essentially represents from historical ties that point towards continuity, order, national cohesion, constitutional loyalty, and more skepticism about very fast changing culture. Those things all now have to exist in this big tent called PP, headed by Aznar.
Big tent, that's the word. That's where Fraga was going, really. At first it was a bunch of Franco reformers who wanted to get together and get these reforms done, and he succeeded there, then in forming a party. The party, however, was not successful because of this Fraga ceiling, so he broadened the base and he assimilated all of these different movements, which he seeded and helped prop up. And then ultimately, it got to the point in which, okay, now he's leading a united political organization. But he needs to take a step back because, of course, there was a limit to how far he could take this with the electorate. He had the respect of journalists. No one disputed his intellectual capacity, his credentials. And by the way, he ran Galicia, I would argue, very well for like 15 years as a regional governor, but the national presidency was just not meant to happen. So he eventually accepts this, not without hesitation. Many would argue that when he handed this power to Hernández Mancha, he was not really happy about that. Many would argue that the Aznar choice he was never fully sure of because, as we've said, he thought the right call was Isabel Tocino. Time proved him right, and he played his service for the center-right. He united different political groups, and the result of that was a net positive for Spanish society.
So now the Aznar period is where we are from 89 up until 2004. So Aznar obviously moved the party institutionally into a much more credible, center-right, liberal, in the European sense, liberal, more free market, more individual power direction. At the same time, he managed to essentially control the party. And there was a line from one of the people that we spoke with recently that kind of took us off guard.
For sure.
Where he mentioned he worked for Aznar, and he mentioned that Aznar is one of the few people in Spanish history that can be said to be like in total control and the intensity to really bring people to his opinion and really get things done. And he listed there are only 3 other people in the long arc of Spanish history as intense and controlling in a good way as Aznar. He said it was Isabel Católica,
Philip
II, and Franco. Yeah, these are putting Aznar in this category is think about this. It's a historic figure that will likely go down in Spanish history for generations and centuries. You frame it in that light.
I believe that his leadership was something that perhaps those within the organization did not think could be as strong as it was. But he paid attention to ideas. Of course, he wanted to recruit the best MP candidates, good governors. He really believed in that. Now, that's obvious. But he also realized that they needed a program. And he spun off an organization that, by the way, he was already building this for him as a regional governor
in Castilla
y León, which means how much he cared about ideas. And these folks were actually given, Fulbright sort of program funds to just go visit the U.S. and learn about the Cato Institute, learn about the Heritage Foundation, learn about some of the more relevant think tanks. And they went and traveled, and they asked for the same sort of program to be set up for them by the UK Embassy. So they did so, and they got to know the IEA, the Adam Smith Institute, the Center for Policy Studies. So they traveled the world, they saw what think tanks were doing, and then they adopted that system for PP here. And PP really comes into government nationally at the 96 election, but PP becomes preparing for being in government and having a ready-made program for governance in between 92 and 93, once Aznar has, chosen his leadership, his cadres. Fraga is now gone to regional politics in Galicia, so that's not a concern. Power is in his hands. He starts performing very well in regional and local elections. And, for example, the Madrid mayorship is won in the late 80s, and that is very important, very symbolic. The Madrid region is won for PP in 95, so 1 year before the national government swings into PP. But for these 3-4 years, they are working towards that goal of having the ideas, the government-ready program. And PP, you were saying it's not very coherent as an organization. Yes, it's not today, but it was. It was definitely while this was taking place, while the Aznar years were crafting a new political organization with its own political speech. Those were the golden years for PP in terms of a party that had a clear idea of what sort of country they believed in, what sort of policies they wanted enacted, and they did enact them, and they were successful in it. So certainly, for PP, those were the days. Who can deny that?
95 was also the year when Aznar had an assassination attempt against him by ETA.
Yes.
And that seems to, from what I can read, that seems to be a pivotal year for Aznar. He survived. They planted a bomb in the car, but the car was armored, so he survived the explosion. And that was also the year when he published the book, The Second Transition. I think someone had made a comment that he became a lot more assured of his ideas after that happened, where he really doubled down on, no, I need to win, I need to change Spain, because this cannot be the case going forward. So he really doubled down on his hardcore liberal individualists pushing Spain forward. The need to increase the machinery of freedom, you need to actually Europeanize and all these kind of things really pushed forward much more assuredly after he survived this assassination attempt.
Suddenly, he was seen as a man of courage. The boring candidate became something else, heroic survivor of an attempt to take his life. ETA, which was a socialist, terrorist, separatist party from the Basque country, took the lives of 1,000 Spaniards, roughly speaking, forced hundreds of thousands of them on exile out of the Basque country region. And luckily today it's formally disbanded. And luckily, we must say that its political heirs are part of the socialist government coalition in parliament.
Yes.
And that is a very sad outcome. It's also, I can't even
Similar
fathom.
issue with Sinn Féin in Ireland.
Yeah. I can't even fathom that they've taken the lives of many socialist leaders. And now the Socialist Party is putting power over principles and just getting into agreements and being in bed with these former terrorists.
Now, to add some important nuance here, because people can make this point and get lost in the weeds. So there are different parties in the Basque region. It isn't only one party. This is the confusion sometimes. So importantly, in the 1996 election, PP got the plurality of votes, as in the single largest number of votes, but not enough votes to form the government by themselves. I believe a 159 or something like that, and they needed a 176 to form government in a majority. So Aznar, as the single largest party, decided to do a coalition agreement with who else? Catalonia.
However, not a coalition government, but a parliamentary
support.
Yeah,
support from
exactly.
Yes, so support from the Catalonia minority and the Basque PNV. Now, importantly, this is not the same party that we're talking about with the ETA.
Yes.
So this is the clarification here. So Aznar got the support of the Catalonian government, of the Catalonian party, and the PNV, a Basque nationalist party, to support his investiture, that's his installment as the president of the government. And in that, he, for example, gave a tax refund, some tariffs for the civil guard in Catalonia, for example, and he gives some slightly more autonomy to some issues in the Basque region, things like that. So he did some negotiation with these parties. But importantly, the PNV is not Bildu. The different.
It's a Basque conservative party.
Correct.
Some PP voters at the local level vote for the mayors of the PNV, and it was traditionally known for being pro-economic freedom, heavy on having strong industries and protecting the local output through strong economy. Of course, it was a separatist party, so there was a fundamental clash of ideas at the core. One is a unionist national party like PP. PNV is a separatist. But Aznar, he needed some votes to have a stable majority in parliament, and he sat down with these folks and with the Catalan separatists that sat on the right wing of the spectrum, which, crazily enough, are the ones that then ultimately had the putsch for independence in 2017, that coup d'etat that happened in Spain some almost 10 years ago. But back then, when these parties were, I guess, more moderate, Aznar sat together with them and told them, hey, territorial thing, we're never going to agree with that. Everything else we can probably agree on. Plus, the socialist government is corrupt. It's not performing well for the economy. For example, Spain could not join the euro because it didn't meet a single criteria for membership, not inflation, debt, deficit, interest rates, nothing. So Aznar sat together with them, center-right parties that, however, were separatists, and he was able to move them towards this idea of, okay, there are some bare minimum here that we can agree on. Let's leave the territorial stuff behind because that's something we're never going to agree with. But let's work on everything else. And he was able to have a stable relationship with them in parliament, with its ups and downs, of course, for 4 years. And then when Spaniards went to the polls again in 2000, he was given an absolute majority, so he no longer needed that support.
Yeah. So in 2000, the PP under Aznar won the absolute majority in Congress. That means they got more than 176 deputies in Congress. So they formed a government all by themselves. So this is, in some ways, I would say the height of PP, but it wasn't actually height of PP because later we'll get to Rajoy actually won a bigger majority. It was the biggest ever win for PP, but yet it feels like this moment between the 96 and 2004 period under Aznar, the Aznar period, felt, looking back now, like a much more assured, much more coherent, and much more dominant PP.
Yes.
Even though numerically they became more dominant later. I find that's an interesting comparison, I think.
Yes, and I guess the power dynamics cannot be understated. You have to understand when you look at what this party has become, that it had to struggle to first get electoral support, then have organizational clarity and unity, create a common message that could gather around a majority of Spaniards, be able to craft agreements with separatist parties that sit at a completely opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to the way they see the country. And he was able to do all of that. So I guess there was a big success. There was also the financial constraints that I mentioned. They were able to clean that up, clean the debt of the party by managing their funds and everything more properly, and then eventually made it to government where they were in power from 1996 to 2004. But most importantly, that's when PP starts entering regional and local governments massively. So yes, surely, PP has been in power on and off at the national level, but for example, since 1995, there's always been a PP president at the regional government in Madrid. Since 9, except for a 4-year period between 2015 and 2019, there's always been a PP mayor in the city of Madrid. And a similar story can be said of many other territories. Some of those regions in Madrid that had that traditionally resisted PP would eventually swing PP under Aznar, so that became the case for some of them. And the last remaining bastions for socialism, which were Andalusia and Extremadura, those ended up becoming a sort of a PP stronghold in more recent times. But the territorial advance of the party, which is, like I said, relevant if you want to be a party with power, with that holds office at the local level, at the regional level, and surely at the national level, that also happens under Aznar.
So the question now comes in, I think the obvious question someone asked, okay, PP won absolute majority in 2000 after it did long run from AP from 76, losing, then a minority government, and then first time ever 2000.
So I just can't help but think of Trump with his, we don't win anymore, we need to win. For the right wing, they kept losing, right? But if you look at it on a more nuanced way, it was going somewhere, but they had to figure it out. Yeah. So some elements were like, let's prop up new movements that solidify us as a broader party. Then let's find if it's a leadership problem. Then let's find a proper leader. Then let's create a program for government. So it took them ages, but...
Yeah, sure. And then we missed the point that also in 91, after the final Suaristas essentially switched to PP, that's when the UDC, the CDS dissolved. Formally dissolved. And that's when that's when the Spanish right really became much more coherent.
And by the way, today, PP is the largest party in Europe. Because if you look at the European elections and you look at the share of votes for all of the different parties that sit in the different European parliamentary groups, the one that contributes the most number of seats with a higher percentage of vote to the largest European Parliament group, which is the European Popular Party, it's the Spanish one. It doesn't hold office because, as you know, the socialist government is in bed with the devil and whatnot, terrorists, communists, social, you name it, right? But it did win the last election.
Yeah. They had the most votes, single party votes.
They just needed 0.5% more of the parliament seats. So it was a very, very, very tight election. And so that's why they're not in power. Every poll says they will be in power eventually when there is an election in a year or so. But until then, like that's just polls, right? Polls can change. But what I'm saying is that political machinery, which we are describing, which seems precarious at times, it's now one of the largest political parties in Europe.
Yeah, it's a very shocking story. Hope this deep history gives the light. At any point in time, especially between 1977 and 1991, PP could have failed. They could have just disbanded again and broke up into all these small parties that we've been come to explain in this episode.
What would have happened if those economic elites that pushed for the Roca Operation had succeeded, and then there was a party that was formally controlled by the largest companies in the country, but had no real civic society elements behind it? We could maybe have a business party model like Berlusconi built in Italy, but it could have also been a disaster. The fact is that voters rejected this, and apparently they were clear in that they wanted something different. That's what they got. They got PP, and PP is now. But by the way, as we know, the traditional right has been threatened, electorally speaking, by the alt-right, so to speak. Now, even the Republican establishment in the U.S. today has been completely shaken up by the Trump phenomenon and everything around it. So the question here is, what has happened to PP in Spain? Well, actually, they remain the largest party. And although Vox, which is a new party that sits to the right of them, has grown and is a relevant party, there also seems to be a ceiling for them, and in the sense that, okay, for every one vote that Vox gets, or every percentage of vote that Vox gets, PP seems to have double that amount. So it is a successful machinery in that sense. But it is also true that, later times, which we won't be able to get into today's episode, so we'll probably leave it for part 2 about PP, later times became more problematic because under Rajoy there was so much disappointment that then this unified center-right became split in three, as we said before. And still today is split in two because PP now has to share, I guess, that part of the spectrum with Vox.
So, okay. Aznar won unprecedented right-wing majority in 2000. But Aznar did not run for election again. This was
self-imposed.
Yeah, so in 96, he said, I will only serve 2 terms. I don't like that. He said that because he, I won't say foolishly, but he really himself caused this retraction of PP. Again, we can get into the actual election, into all the issues there, but self-imposing a term limit of 2 terms at the height of your ambition and your power and your control is such a very shocking thing for any person to do.
Unless you believe that there are principled leaders that actually do believe in limiting the power that one individual can hold. And that is a very American revolution type of approach. And he wanted to do that. He wanted to limit power. And that resonated with the Spanish voters, and I think it's one of the reasons that legitimized himself as a viable and a man of principle, because here on the other end was the Socialist Party that was seemingly willing to just do anything it took to stay in power. And the more scandals that came out, the more corruption that was unveiled. They even sponsor state terrorism to go after the separatist, socialist, Basque separatist terrorists of ETA, which, of course, surely, like, my contempt for this group, for ETA, is infinite, but you should go after them with the rule of law in your hand, not by sponsoring state terrorism, which is what the socialists did at some point.
We will get to that in our PSOE episode, Gonzalez. But yes.
Dirty Socialist Party. But there's so many sins in their past. So many sins.
Yeah.
On what past and present and future.
Sure.
We did that Flash episode on socialist corruption that is up there on the archives. And it's just like... we could do a Flash episode on new corruption scandals every single week. But anyway, beyond dirty PSOE, the abuse of power.
La PSOE.
La PSOE, yeah. We call it La PSOE sometimes because it sounds like La Mafia, like we use a feminine adjective for that. But so Aznar did that and limited himself to 2 mandates as a way to signal, I am not like Felipe González. I am not like the socialists. I don't want to be here forever. I am not willing to do whatever it takes to be in power. I have a plan. I want to implement it. I want to be reelected and continue this for 4 more years, and then I will be done. I will go home, and I won't come back into politics ever again. He fulfilled his promise.
He agreed.
I won't justify the man for being a man of principle in a world of lies.
That's true, because even with other people, even other ministers, after they left the cabinet, they became deputies, they did other things, but Aznar literally stepped back. He didn't become anything else after that, did he? No deputy, no mayor. Nothing.
Another harakiri in a way. So the Franco regime and its leadership does an harakiri to allow the transition to democracy. Fraga builds a party and creates a center-right force, but then suicides himself as a national leader just to allow Aznar to come over. And then Aznar willingly commits to leaving power 8 years after the fact he gets elected, which he did. So there is a lot of, self-constraint. And I think that really comes into a direct clash with the power grab that is the main characteristic of the socialist left in Spain. And still today, or even more today than ever, you can see how there are some limits that PP would have never surpassed or that Vox would never advocate for overpassing. And those limits have clearly not been respected by the socialists. And I think the polarization you see in political life is because there are some rules of the game. Some of them are written, some of them are unwritten. But PP was willing to behave as a loyal member of a democracy where there is alternance of power.
They want to be the modern European party, the adults in the room.
Yeah.
So Aznar, before he formally resigned, or not resigned, after the new election, he said, I will not run again.
And didn't step in.
Right. So he appointed, more or less appointed, his successor. It was Mariano Rajoy. Which, again, to me, was a very curious choice. I do not know in detail the alternatives, but looking back, at least from my perch coming into Spain, why would you choose Rajoy to be Aznar? Why would you choose Rajoy? He doesn't seem to have any particular ideological bent. He doesn't have any particular extreme charisma. I mean, he can barely talk Spanish. Infamous lines of him on T-shirts and stuff of things just mess up having a normal conversation.
There was 3 relevant ministers that were responsible for, many of the reforms that took place under Aznar that were also considered to be in the running for succession. Number 1 was everyone's favorite on paper, which was Rodrigo Rato. Number 2 was, the guy that had been in, I don't know if he was a minister in 7 or 8 different departments of government, who is Mariano Rajoy. And number 3 was Jaime Mayor Oreja, who originally came from the moderate circles,
PDP.
Of PDP. And today you could argue he's a staunchly conservative member of the conservative think tank groups in across Spain. So there was 3 options, right? 3 options, or at least those were the options he considered. And he chose the successor. He was pointed a finger at someone. That is why sometimes that is called a dedazo. Dedo means finger. So it was like, okay, the finger was pointed at someone, right? And the finger could have been pointed at Rato, but he was seen as perhaps an elitist, economic technocrat.
He was too arrogant, apparently.
A bit seen as an arrogant guy internally in the government. Maybe wouldn't resonate with the middle class or the lower income spectrum. It eventually became the head of the IMF. So surely we are talking of someone who was a darling of the economic elites. Then he was disgraced because he agreed to come back into public life to pilot an operation to make a semi-government, semi-public savings bank, to consolidate a few of them that were essentially broke after the financial crisis in 2007-8. Put them together as a bank, privatize it, put it on the stock market, and save it. And that operation failed. And it did fail, and it was thrown under the bus by the very same PP colleagues that he had working under him during the Aznar government. So he was found guilty of series of charges, and he did time in jail. So many times sometimes it's argued, well, yeah, the economic superstar of the Aznar years, he ended up in jail. Yeah, but these are two completely unrelated episodes of Rodrigo Ratos' life. And by the way, he was never the most pro-free market guy. The more you learn about the inner dynamics of the Aznar government, you find out he was more of a corporativist elite, more of a technocratic elite. But the free market ideas, those came straight from Aznar and his inner circle, right? So he just executed those, and sometimes try to water them down a little bit even.
I should say, just because we haven't spelled it out as much as we should, but time constraints, so we can't have an 8-hour episode on Pepe. But it was Aznar that did the modernization of Spain's economy and the state. Got into the Eurozone, got into all the European Union stuff. It did all of the reformulation of the labor market, the construction market, the housing market.
Budget stability. Lower taxes, privatization, liberalization, you name it. Like I said, take out Reagan and Thatcher out of the equation,
He was very famous for the comment he made where he said, I don't want Spain to be in Club Med. The Mediterranean, Southern European laggards. I want Spain to be in the center of Europe, with Germany, with France, England. So he did all of that effort to really get Spain to be a modern, vibrant economy.
And if you look at who were the main Western leaders at the time and how were they, meeting and arranging the political affairs of the West, you would see Aznar there, right up there with, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Tony Blair. He was, you could argue his profile was as high as Chirac or Schroeder, if not higher.
It's not higher.
So
people forget that now. People forget that. Again, as I mentioned, when Aznar came into the head of PP, Spanish population less than 1% foreign born. And, when he left, it was like close to 15, 16, 17%. So the Spain that people know today,
modern Spain
really is Aznar's Spain.
Yeah, for sure. And Madrid being the most shining example, and the Madrid reforms were created by one of his key people in government, who was Esperanza Aguirre.
Yeah.
And those today live on through
he
Governor
chose Esperanza to lead Madrid. We discussed that on our episode with her.
Yes. So then, of course, he could have chosen Mayor Oreja, but he was seen as too tied to the, fighting terrorism bit, maybe seen as too socially conservative, so I maybe didn't want to go that direction. And he went with Rajoy, who was, the grayish candidate, not very ideological, but very apt in the sense that he had been in, I don't want to get this wrong, but he was in several departments of government. A crazy amount of them. He was education minister, industry minister, public administration minister. He was in several departments of government as the minister responsible for them. So he was seen as an able statesman who could, run the country. Plus, the polls were fantastic for PP, so no one could have expected the defeat in 2004.
So that's the critical point. The polls were fantastic. This is why we here are saying, the polls are so good for PP next year.
But you never know.
My goodness, things happen.
So I think we can wrap the part one here, which is where, really we've seen PP on the ups and downs, but surely on the overall upwards trajectory since Franco dies all the way up to Aznar's decision to leave power in hands of Rajoy. And now is when, it will get a bit more complicated. In part two, even more complicated, because it surely was an easy path. But as our listeners will find out, then when this choice is made, Rajoy will not win power, but he will remain in power for ages until he is finally able to win power. And he is president under a deep crisis, does some stabilization program measures that were very good, some were very bad. So a lot of people lose confidence in PP for different reasons, and the Spanish right becomes split in three and currently in two. But that's for another day.
And we will discuss why PP, after every single person thought PP was going to win the 2004 election, up until the week of the election.
Oh, yeah.
Then there was the biggest terrorist attack in European history in peacetime, and everything changed.
Exactly. So we'll put a wrap on this one right here, and we'll follow up in our next episode with a very enlightening tale of, let's say, the last 22 years of history of the Popular Party in Spain. So until then, thanks for joining us.